If you didn't post it, did it happen? You know the joke. But you have probably felt the real version of it too. A year goes by where you took no photos, kept no journal, sent fewer messages than usual, and when you try to remember it later, it feels thinner than the years around it, not empty, just harder to prove. Now stretch that feeling across 300 years and you have the Dark Ages. For centuries, that was the label historians gave to the period in Western Europe roughly between the 5th and 10th centuries. A dark, empty stretch between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe, supposedly marked by ignorance, superstition, and civilizational collapse. But the real answer is far stranger than nothing happened. Something did happen. It just happened during a stretch when almost nobody was writing it down. Start with where the term actually comes from, because it is not as old as you would think. The Italian scholar Petrarch coined it in the 1330s, and he was not doing careful historical analysis. He was doing marketing for his own era. Petrarch loved classical Rome. He wanted his own time period to look like a glorious rebirth of that world. So he needed a villain in between, a long stretch of darkness that his generation could claim to be rising out of. The label was never neutral. It was a value judgment dressed up as a historical fact, and it stuck for 600 years. So why does the period actually look dark to us? Mostly because the written record thins out dramatically. Fewer chronicles, fewer letters, fewer inscriptions carved into stone. And if your only tool for understanding the past is text, a gap in the text looks exactly like a gap in history itself. But is that the same thing? In 1982, the historian Ramsay MacMullen coined a term for something that had been quietly distorting how people read the Roman world for a century: the epigraphic habit. Romans loved inscribing things in stone. Tombstones, dedications, public announcements, all carved and left behind by the tens of thousands. That habit rose sharply through the 1st and 2nd centuries, peaked and then dropped off hard. For a long time, historians treated that drop as direct evidence of Roman decline. Fewer inscriptions, they assumed, must mean fewer people, less wealth, less civilization. MacMullen pushed back. He pointed out that the habit of inscribing stone was exactly that, a habit. A cultural practice tied to specific audiences, specific fashions, specific reasons people wanted their name carved somewhere permanent. When that specific practice fell out of style, it did not necessarily mean the underlying society collapsed with it. It meant people stopped writing things on stone. Those are not automatically the same fact. Does that reframe the Dark Ages for you a little? It should. If a culture's habit of documentation can decline separately from the culture itself, then a written record going quiet does not prove that life went quiet along with it. It just means the scribes had other things going on, or different reasons to write, or no institution left standing that wanted things carved and preserved. But here is where the story refuses to stay comfortable, because it would be convenient to conclude that nothing bad actually happened, that it was all just paperwork drying up while ordinary life carried on fine underneath. The archaeologist Brian Ward Perkins spent years testing that comfortable version against physical evidence, and in 2005 he published a book making the opposite case. He looked past the missing texts entirely and went straight to the objects. Roman Britain, for instance, had sophisticated pottery industries, mass-produced, well-made, widely distributed. After the Roman administrative system collapsed there, that pottery essentially disappears from the archaeological record. What replaces it is cruder, more local, less refined, and it was not just pottery. Ward Perkins studied cattle bones recovered from sites across the former empire and found something striking. Livestock actually shrank in physical size after Rome's collapse and did not recover that lost size again until the 1300s. Smaller cattle usually means worse breeding conditions, worse nutrition, a less specialized and less resourced agricultural system. None of that comes from a missing chronicle. It comes from a cow's actual skeleton, dug out of actual ground. So hold both of those findings at once. MacMullen says, a documentation habit can vanish without the underlying world collapsing. Ward Perkins says, sometimes the underlying world really did get materially worse, and you can prove it without a single surviving sentence. The truth about any dark stretch of history probably lives somewhere between those two men, and neither one is lying. Which raises an obvious question. If written texts cannot always be trusted to tell you what really happened, and sometimes objects like pottery and bone can, What happens to the years that left behind almost no objects and almost no texts at all? Take the year 536. If you had asked most historians a generation ago what happened in Western Europe in 536, you would have gotten very little. A few scattered, confused mentions from writers of the period describing a dimmed sun and a strange chill, not much to work with. Then a team led by the medieval historian Michael McCormick at Harvard, working with the glaciologist Paul Majewski and the dendrochronologist Ulf Bündgen, went looking for the year not in libraries, but in ice and wood. Bündgen found the signature buried in tree rings, a sudden sharp collapse in growth beginning in 536, the trees barely adding any width at all for years, evidence of a climate catastrophe severe enough to stunt forests across the entire northern hemisphere. McCormick and Majewski, drilling into an alpine glacier with a level of chemical precision that let them date individual years almost to the season, found volcanic fallout embedded in the ice from that exact period, confirming a massive eruption had thrown enough ash and sulfur into the atmosphere to dim the sun itself for well over a year. Temperatures across Europe dropped by more than 2 degrees Celsius. Crops failed on a continental scale. Famine followed, and within a few years, plague followed the famine. None of that needed a single surviving eyewitness account to be proven. The atmosphere wrote it into the ice, one thin layer at a time. The trees wrote it into their rings, one starved growing season at a time. McCormick would later call it, only half joking, one of the worst years to be alive in recorded history, a year almost nobody wrote much about, reconstructed almost entirely from things that were never meant to be a record at all. That is the real shape of the answer here. The Dark Ages were never simply dark. They were under-narrated. Some of that under-narration hid genuine decline, the kind Ward Perkins can trace through a cow's femur. Some of it hid a documentation habit that quietly changed shape for reasons that had nothing to do with collapse, the kind McMullen identified in a stack of missing tombstones. And some of the darkest, least written years turn out to be recoverable in astonishing detail, just not from anything anyone ever intended to be read. You have almost certainly lived through a version of this yourself, a stretch of months or years that left behind no photos, no messages, nothing you could hand someone later as proof it mattered. Maybe it really was quiet, low on incident, genuinely uneventful, closer to Ward Perkins's shrinking cattle. Or maybe something was happening the entire time, just not in a form anyone thought to write down, closer to McMullen's missing inscriptions. Either way, the absence of a record was never proof of an absence of significance. It only ever proved an absence of documentation. The evidence just moves to different places when nobody is writing it down. It moves into the size of your habits instead of your journal entries, into the condition of your relationships instead of your messages, into your body the way tree rings hold a bad year long after everyone stops talking about it. Someone who knew how to read those things could probably still reconstruct what that quiet stretch of your life actually cost you or actually gave you. The same way a glaciologist can reconstruct a volcanic eruption almost nobody wrote a word about. If you didn't post it, did it happen? Somewhere, in some form that was never meant to be a record, it almost certainly still left a ring.